Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for doing the essays. It's taken a long time to mark them, but I think it would be worth spending just about 10 minutes or so just going through them. It's mainly structure. It's mainly structure that we need to be talking about, and the vast majority of you, that's where you need to be making your improvements. I'm not going to worry too much about going through all of the potential points you could have made. They're on the feedback sheet that you've got, and they're in the textbook. So the content should have been there. It's the technique and how you go about writing an essay that's important. So most of this is written on the sheet, but I just wanted you to hear it from me. Right, introductions. There were so many introductions where I was writing, how does this link to the question? The question was, are pressure groups good for democracy? And you have, in many cases, just defined what a pressure group is. Now that's great, but you have to link it to the question. If someone said to you, where do you want to go on Friday night? You wouldn't start saying going out is what people do when they want to have fun. It is some time they spend with their friends. You'd answer the question. So answer the question. It doesn't need to have detail. It doesn't need to have depth. Just list the points that you're going to make. Link it to the question. It doesn't have to be long at all. But so many of you were just putting in knowledge about pressure groups, and that's not relevant to the question. Examples. You all have to be giving more examples, bar sort of, I'd say about 20% of you. You did research. I set both classes research on pressure groups, and the idea was that was where your examples are going to come from. So you should have 5 pressure groups at least that you know about. You know about their workings. You know what things they've done. You know how they've got involved, any legislation that has happened as a result of their work. So use those. Please don't keep using Fathers for Justice all the time for everything. Please don't keep using RSPB and RSPCA for everything. And definitely don't use the same pressure group as 2 examples in your work. You need to be providing depth. If you're using the same example for 2 things, straight away it just makes the examiner think you don't know any more. And if you don't know any more, find some more. Go back to your research. The other thing about examples is you need to use the best example, not just an example. It's really important. This shows that you really understand what you're talking about. So if you're trying to give an example of how pressure group activity has forced the government to make changes, don't give the tuition fee protests as a change, because I don't know if you've noticed, there's still £9,000. It didn't make any difference, all those protests. The Countryside Alliance protests about the fox hunting ban, they did, because it scaled down the legislation. It meant that they didn't get the full ban that they wanted. It was just hunting with dogs that was banned. The other one that so many of you use, and I went back to the textbook to see if it was in the textbook but couldn't see it anywhere, is Forest being a really good example of a pressure group that gets what it wants because it has such rich backers. Now it does have rich financiers. It's financed by the tobacco industry, but it still didn't manage to stop the smoking ban, and it still didn't stop those horrible pictures being on cigarette packets of people like with their gums sort of falling apart because of smoking. Smokers take that on board. But that didn't happen. So why give that as an example of a rich pressure group that always gets what it wants? Because it doesn't. You might as well not put the example. Use the best example, not just an example. The other thing that you need to do, and this is frustrating from my point of view because we say this every time, is you have to explain why you're making the point. If you're saying one of the things that is good about pressure groups for democracy is they educate the electorate, and then you go and explain how they educate the electorate, and a lot of you talked about, the BMA with their obesity research, or the AA with stuff on speed limits, then say why that's good for democracy. Otherwise, and I say this all the time, you might as well be putting in brackets, and this is good for democracy because Mr. Jolly told me it was. And I know this is good for democracy because it's in the textbook. You've got to show knowledge. So the reason that is good for education, as I put on the sheet, is because it makes a more informed electorate. And knowledge is power, and when people understand things, they can question the government, they can ask questions, they can have higher expectations, something along those lines. But don't just say it's good for democracy without explaining why. The other thing that lots of you did, not lots, a few, was saying that pressure groups, when they carry out illegal activity, this is obviously bad for democracy. Well, I don't really know why. Explain why. You may be able to explain why something being illegal is not democratic, but it depends how illegal. I mean, if a pressure group continually does illegal stuff and it's a tiny, tiny little pressure group and it gets what it wants, that would be bad for democracy. But I can't think of any example of that happening. It's things like, again, you came back to Fathers for Justice or Greenpeace taking, sort of blockading ports or runways or going onto ships They're using that activity because they haven't got any other option. It's not like they haven't got loads of people supporting them. That's just the option they're taking. I think you need to be careful when you're saying something illegal is automatically not democratic. There probably is an argument there that it isn't, but you've got to explain why. You can't just say that it is. The conclusion really, really caused the problems for so many people. There were loads of people who got 14 and 15 that should have got much, much higher because you simply ran out of time. Now, this may be, apart from the mock, the first time you've done a 25 mark question in time conditions, and we'll be doing some more. But you can't just write, oops, ran out of time at the end. You've got to sort it out. So, for the people who ran out of time, if you know you're going to run out of time, your final paragraph, don't write it. Bullet point it and write a conclusion. Because you'll lose more marks for not having a conclusion than you will for not having a final paragraph. Or, don't run out of time. Plan it a little bit better. Some of you are writing massive long introductions or hugely long points that repeated themselves 2 or 3 times. You can't be doing that. You need to make sure you're focused, tight paragraphs. Here's the point. Here's why it's relevant. Here's an example. Move on. Most of you have got the structure of it right, the however, that was working really well, but the conclusion is still an issue. The thing that you need to have in the conclusion is a conclusion. It needs to conclude. You can't say both. You can't say, well, pressure groups are both good and bad for democracy. That's a terrible conclusion. You need to have a view. I don't want to be harsh. No one really cares what your view is. It doesn't matter if this isn't the thing you're spending your time awake at night going, oh my God, a pressure group's good for democracy. But in the essay, at least, you have to have a view. Either yes, they are, or no, they're not. But what you can't do is completely ignore everything that you said on the other side of the argument. So if you've put 3 points saying we are good for democracy, 3 points saying pressure groups aren't, and then your conclusion say, well, obviously pressure groups are good for democracy. I'm just thinking, well, what about all those things you said why they're not good for democracy? Was that a lie? Were you lying to me? You've got to do something to aggregate those views. That word again, you've got to put them together. So even though this thing happens, it's far more important because... So we could be talking about the fact that their pressure groups are dictated, their influence is dictated by their size and their finance and whether they're insider status. And yeah, that is true. But it's better to have them than not. But because rich and large pressure groups often are that way because they have lots of people supporting them. So that is still a good democratic point. If you were asked a question and you had to provide a two-sided argument, you don't prove your point by just ignoring one of the sides you've made. My politics teacher, when I was at school, talked about building up an argument and knocking it down. That's what you've got to do. You have to say, here's this, and the reason that is more important than that is because. So please think about doing that, and it is becoming frustrating because we've done this every single time. The other thing, I think I've said this, you have to have a conclusion. It's so important. You're really in trouble if you don't. So look back through the sheet. Please think about what points you could make. I've given an example of a paragraph on there that is not terrible, but hopefully you'll be able to see how it could be made better. And then 2 paragraphs that I think most people would be able to write. I haven't done paragraphs, I mean, no offence to the 2 girls who wrote these paragraphs, but I think they're possible for most people. You have to start showing that you understand what you're doing and not just writing stuff because it says so in the book. So, hope that all makes sense. Hope you're all missing me. You're lucky I put a shirt on. I've been in my dressing gown most of the time. Have fun. Enjoy. Have a good Easter. And I'll be back after Easter and we'll crack on with political parties. You'll be fine. Enjoy. Bye.